January 17th, 1944. The Pacific dawn breaks pale and humid over the Marshall Islands. The sea is unnaturally calm, a flat mirror disturbed only by distant wakes. On the coral edge of a low island, Japanese Marines crouch inside sandbagged revetments, their rifles already damp with salt air. Somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen engines pulse like a distant heartbeat. Then comes the sound, low at first, almost mistaken for thunder, followed by a single, precise column of water erupting near the shoreline. Seconds later, another shell lands closer, and then another. Each impact walks forward with deliberate certainty, as if guided by an invisible hand. For the Japanese defenders, this moment marks more than the beginning of another American bombardment. It signals a transformation in naval warfare that has already reshaped the Pacific War. By early 1944, the United States Navy had perfected a system of naval gunfire support that combined aerial spotting, advanced fire control radar, and disciplined communication between ships, aircraft, and forward observers. What had once been imprecise area bombardment was now becoming something closer to surgical destruction. The Marines on these islands were about to experience the full consequence of that evolution. Japanese naval doctrine before the war had emphasized decisive surface engagements and the valor of close combat. Shore bombardment, while expected, was assumed to be blunt and wasteful. Pre-war exercises and early war experience suggested that battleship guns fired from miles offshore could terrorize but rarely annihilate well-dug-in defenders. Accuracy, especially against small island targets, was thought to be limited. Many Japanese officers believed that discipline, concealment, and endurance would allow them to survive bombardment and then fight the Americans on land, where spirit and sacrifice would decide the outcome. What they encountered instead was a relentless choreography of destruction. American float planes and carrier-based aircraft circled high above the islands, sometimes barely visible against the sun. These were not attackers in the traditional sense, but spotters, trained observers who watched every shell splash and radioed precise corrections back to the fleet. Left 50, add 100, on target. With each adjustment, the fire grew more exact. Bunkers that had survived hours of shelling earlier in the war were now struck directly. Artillery positions vanished in geysers of sand and steel. Communication trenches collapsed inward, sealing defenders underground. U.S. Navy records from the Marshalls, Saipan, and later Iwo Jima describe this process in methodical detail. After-action reports note that battleships like USS Iowa and USS New Jersey could place heavy shells within tens of meters of designated targets when guided by aerial spotters. Radar fire control systems allowed ships to continue firing accurately, even when smoke, weather, or distance obscured visual cues. One naval report from 1944 concluded that spotter-directed fire neutralized enemy positions with unprecedented efficiency, a phrase that understated the psychological impact on those receiving it. Japanese accounts preserved in post-war memoirs and interrogations reveal shock bordering on disbelief. Survivors described shells that seemed to search for them, walking steadily along ridgelines and trench lines as if intelligence itself guided the guns. What they had expected, a storm that could be endured, became something far more personal and terrifying. The bombardment did not merely blanket the island, it dissected it. Each correction tightened the circle, reducing places of safety until there were none. The recurring symbol in these moments was sound, not the roar of the guns themselves, but the whistling descent of each shell, followed by the brief silence before impact. That sound became a measure of American capability. It spoke of factories far across the ocean producing shells by the millions, of training programs that turned pilots into precise observers, of radios and radar working in harmony. To the Japanese Marines, that sound represented an industrial and organizational power beyond individual bravery. This experience began to erode long-held assumptions. Japanese soldiers had been taught that American forces lacked endurance and spiritual resolve, that they relied on machines rather than will. Yet the accuracy of naval gunfire suggested a different truth: discipline expressed through systems, coordination, and patience. The bombardment did not rage blindly. It corrected itself, learned, and adapted. In that sense, it mirrored the broader American approach to war: methodical, resource-rich, and relentlessly focused on reducing uncertainty. As island battles continued through 1944 and 1945, this pattern repeated. On Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, naval spotters worked in close coordination with ground forces, adjusting fire sometimes within minutes of a request. Japanese defenders increasingly found that concealment offered diminishing returns. The landscape itself became a liability, mapped and measured by observers overhead. The shock was not only physical but ideological: the realization that sacrifice alone could not overcome a system designed to eliminate variables. By the war's final year, even Japanese high command acknowledged the effectiveness of American naval gunfire. Internal reports noted the extraordinary precision of enemy bombardments and their effect on morale. For the men in the bunkers, however, this acknowledgement came too late. The sound of descending shells had already rewritten their understanding of the enemy. In the aftermath, survivors carried this memory with them. Some spoke not of hatred but of awe. The accuracy they witnessed forced a reevaluation of what modern warfare meant and what kind of nation could sustain such effort across an ocean. The shell's whistle became, in retrospect, a symbol of abundance, not only of material but of coordination and shared purpose. In the end, those moments on the Coral Islands point toward a larger truth. Freedom in this war was defended not just by courage, but by systems that valued precision over impulse and cooperation over isolation. The sound that once signaled terror now echoes as a reminder that in the Pacific, the balance between ideologies was measured shell by shell, correction by correction, until accuracy itself became destiny.